Hello, good evening. Welcome if you're joining me at our Tuesday evening Bible study slot, and if you're catching up with this video at any other time, then a very warm welcome to you as well. I'm sure you probably all know who I am. My name is Beth and I work on the staff team at Crofton Parish, and we are coming to you this evening by the wonders of modern technology directly from my conservatory, where I am sincerely hoping that my various animals will behave themselves, and apologies in advance if they don't. These Bible studies are an opportunity for us to look a little bit more deeply at the passages that we are studying and thinking about on Sunday mornings. And it gives us this is such an unusual time of our national life. If you're looking at this as part of your weekly home group time, then there will be opportunities for you to think about things, to answer some questions together in your small groups. But we're just going to start by recapping the story that we started to think about a couple of days ago on Sunday morning. And as we do that, perhaps we should start with a prayer. Lord Jesus, I just want to thank you for this story, the story of the widow of Nain and her son. And Lord, I just pray that as we come to think about this more deeply this evening, you will help us to learn what it can teach us about ourselves, what it can teach us about our relationship with you and our relationship with each other. Amen. So this is part of a series that's been running for some weeks now. We're taking a look at some of the encounters that we read about that Jesus had, encounters with a number of different people and very different types of people. We're looking at them as they're told to us by Luke in his gospel. And as I said on Sunday, Luke is a really great person to do this with because he was a doctor. So by his very profession, he had a great interest in people. And what that means in his gospel is that you get lots of lovely little details about the people around Jesus, which is really helpful to us in this series. These are stories that we very often look at in church, in home groups, in Bible studies. And if you've been around church for very long, then you probably will know all of them really very well. And normally, when we look at these lovely stories, these encounters, we're looking to find what they can teach us about Jesus' character, which is great. But in this encounter series, we're taking just a slightly different focus. You see, Jesus was the only man in human history, the only person in human history to have been fully human, to go through his life free of all that stuff that drags all of us down, what we call sin. And God wants all of us to be fully human too. So the encounters that Jesus has with other people, they don't just teach us what Jesus is like, they teach us something about ourselves too, something about what it's like to be fully human. So last week with Richard, we looked at Jesus' encounter with a Roman centurion, a powerful man. We thought a lot about power and how it gets used. He was in charge of many other men, and yet despite that, he was a man who displayed a great and very unexpected faith. Today we're looking at the very next passage in Luke chapter 7. So get your Bibles out if you haven't already, and let's just take a look, because we're going to start by reading the passage that we're looking at this evening, which is coming from Luke chapter 7, verses 11 to 17. Soon afterwards, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." Then he went up, and he touched the bier that they were carrying him on, and the bearers stood still. And he said, "Young men, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up, and he began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. They were all filled with awe and praised God. A great prophet has appeared among us, they said. God has come to help his people. This news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country. So Jesus and his disciples, they are on the move. They've been in Capernaum and now they've walked on to Nain. It's a journey of about 30 miles, which would have been a couple of days' walk. And the whole area that they are walking in isn't terribly far from Nazareth. It's the area that most of Jesus' ministry takes place in. And as they come towards the town or the village of Nain, they meet a funeral procession. The body would have been wrapped in cloth and it would have just been placed on a board. And the death had probably or quite likely taken place that day. The Jews usually buried bodies immediately for very practical reasons. And of course that is still very much common practice in that part of the world today. And the local community was there too, mourning with the mother. Luke tells us that a large crowd of people from the town were with her. We know nothing about this man, and we know next to nothing about his mother. And as far as I am aware, we don't hear anything more about either of them before the story or indeed after it. And it's really, really interesting that this story, this encounter with Jesus, it comes directly after his encounter with a Roman centurion, because the contrast between the two of them was really very great. The centurion, a powerful man, a man in charge of other men, a figure of authority in the army of the occupying Roman Empire. It would have seemed really odd to those looking on that Jesus interacted with him. And now it will seem pretty odd that he interacts with this lady too. And although we don't know very much about her, we do know one very important thing. She was a widow, she was alone, and her son would have been her only means of support. So she really is at the bottom of the social heap. Throughout the whole of the Old Testament, which of course were the scriptures that she and her community would have been very, very familiar with, widows and orphans are portrayed as the most helpless people that there are in society, and that is for a very good reason. So Luke is making a very powerful point here, putting these stories back to back in his gospel. He's saying, look, this good news, this salvation that Jesus offers, it's for everyone. It's for men, it's for women, it's for rich people, for poor people, for Jews, for all the occupying Roman forces as well. Jesus treats them all the same. The thing that they have in common is that they trust him. We are going to have a bit of a break point here, and I'm going to leave you with a couple of questions to think about if you're on your own, or to discuss together if you are in a group. Can you think of modern day equivalents for the centurion and the widow? How does it feel that the good news of Jesus is just as much for either of those two people, for everyone? And how can we make sure that we engage with everyone in our society when we share the gospel? We're just going to have a couple of minutes of break now. hope that you were able to have some useful thinking or discussing time there. But now we are going to move on a little bit in our passage. We've met a lady, a widow. But the most important thing about this lady right now is that she's a mother who has lost her only son, quite probably within the last few hours. So she's reeling. She's in shock. She's in pain. She's grieving. You know, when Old Testament prophets want to invoke a picture of the deepest mourning, this is the picture that they use. A widow or a mother grieving for an only child. One of the prophets, Zechariah, it's chapter 12, verse 10 of his prophecy. He says this, "And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn son." You will find similar pictures if you want to look them up later in Jeremiah chapter 6 and in Amos in chapter 8. So this woman, she's in the worst possible position in society already, and even worse than that, she's now lost her only child. There is no loss like this loss. No loss like losing a child. The Bible acknowledges that. And it's a really, really difficult subject, this, but it's one that I would like us to think about for a few minutes this evening. And in order to help us to do that, I have asked Martin, who is my husband, to come and help me with this.
Good evening, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
So this is Martin. This is my husband. And we're very blessed, aren't we, to have
We certainly are.
two amazing kids who are, how old?
18 and 15.
That's right, Stephanie and Toby. But I think it's fair to say that the road that we travelled to get there was not an easy one. Is that right?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, so we married quite a long time ago now, but we were married for 9 years before we had Steph, our first child. And during that time, it's fair to say we had ups and downs, and particularly with regards to miscarriages during that time.
Yeah, it was for us. It was miscarriage. We miscarried our first child just a few months after we got married, didn't we? And then subsequently over the years we lost a number more, and the last miscarriage that we had was actually the twin sibling of our son Toby. So it was something that happened for us over a long period of time, over many years, wasn't it? And I think it's fair to say that we struggled enormously with that.
We did, very much so.
But you and I, Martin and I, both grew up in a world where you didn't talk about things. You didn't make a fuss, ever, under any circumstances. And you never, under any circumstances, took time off work. So I would have a miscarriage and just never take any time off work, never tell anyone, just carry straight on, straight through. We didn't tend to tell friends or family. And if I'm honest, and this is really awful, I didn't even tell you the first time, did I?
No, that's right.
Martin was...
you did eventually.
Yeah, Martin was sitting exams at the time, and so I just didn't want to give you any more to worry about, so I just didn't tell him. And with hindsight, that probably wasn't such a great idea, was it?
Well, I'm not blaming you for that, but of course, nowadays, I think we deal with we can deal with things in a different way. I think the way we handled it was probably not the best way in hindsight. I mean, hindsight is a wonderful thing, of course, but I'm not sure we necessarily dealt with it in the right way. I know for myself, I bottled things up for years. In fact, I mean, for myself, I'm not sure I really started to come to terms with it for maybe, golly, 20 years later, more than 20 years later. I remember the emotions bubbling up at a new wine conference just a few years ago, and I remember feeling that God was close to me and God was helping me through that, but it was many, many years later.
I think, and you can help us here, because Martin, I'm sure most people already know this, but when you're not being a dad and helping me with being a cameraman, what else do you do?
So I'm a GP in my spare time, and yeah, certainly in my work, as part of that, I do deal with couples, particularly the ladies. The chaps don't tend to come in so much, but particularly with the ladies, struggling with baby loss, whether it's miscarriage, stillbirth, or even sadly beyond.
I think it's fair to say that, I mean, the first time we lost a child through miscarriage was 27 years ago now, and I think it didn't seem to me that there was a great deal in the way of help, practical help, with dealing with the aftermath of a miscarriage on a physical level, and certainly not on an emotional level. Now, it's fair to say that I didn't really seek that out anyway, but I don't really think there was an awful lot there. Martin, is that situation different now?
Yes, I think so. I think that's fair to say. So certainly there are a lot more services available now than there were 25 to 30 years ago. In particular, obviously, with looking at the mental trauma that couples go through, and I think helpfully, I think there's also more available for the men as well. I think certainly in our day back then, I'm not sure there was anything at all available for men, and it was, but yeah, there is more available now. I'm pleased to say.
So, if you are experiencing this for yourself now, then GP is a good place to start. We've actually got some information about some services that can help that I'll put up in a little while. But there is stuff available now, isn't it? That's fair to say.
Yeah, very much so.
So do ask, do help. The other thing that I used to find, on the rare occasions, and it was rare, when I actually told anyone that I'd had a miscarriage, was friends can be terribly well-meaning, but not always terribly helpful. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's true. I mean, people will often, I'm sure many of you will have come across this as well, that, will come out with some glib comments.
So,
and I don't blame them for that. It's hard to help comfort a friend or a relative when they're going through a trauma. So what do? You try and comfort them in some way, but sometimes they can be rather unhelpful comments.
Yeah, so I mean, some of the things that I think it's good not to say are things like, well, at least you can conceive, which is well meant but not incredibly helpful when you've just lost a baby. Well, of course, 1 in 5 pregnancies end in miscarriage. I know that that's true, but again, it's not always terribly helpful. And the other thing that people used to say to me was they used to start asking me about what I'd been eating or drinking. I know from the deepest personal experience that when you lose a baby through miscarriage, the person that you blame the most is yourself. And I found myself looking for any excuse to blame myself. When you lose a baby, it's not your fault. And to have well-meaning, lovely friends asking you what you were eating and drinking before that happened is not always the most helpful thing.
No, as a doctor, I do try and tell couples this when they've lost a baby, that that actually it's not their fault. You know, nothing that you can do is likely to have an outcome, you know, within sensible parameters, is likely to have a negative impact on the baby and lose a baby like that. But people do. You blame themselves, and I think also around the medical profession we tend to have some rather unhelpful medical terminology.
So was it the penultimate, not the one before Toby's twin, miscarriage that we had was just after we'd arrived here, so 16 years ago now. And it was a situation where fundamentally the baby had died, but the pregnancy continued, and I continued to get fatter, and everything seemed normal except that the baby was dead, and of course you don't know. And the medical term for that is a missed abortion, which is delightful and horribly emotive for someone who's struggling. And I found I know it's just a name. I know it doesn't really mean anything, but to have that spoken about you and around you by consultants and other people in the hospital, I found that incredibly unhelpful. So and for them it was something that they were dealing with, you know, regularly, but for me this was my baby, and it was dead, and so I found that really hard. I think that's right.
I'm afraid the medical profession we're a bit like that. Sometimes we do forget that. Sometimes I think that we're dealing with humans, we're dealing with emotions, and we use terminology that's not always helpful. I think we're probably a little bit better than we used to be, but not always.
But I think, although we didn't talk about it as much as we should have done, and we can look back now and see how we could have done it better. We did find a way to hand that to God, didn't we? In the end, I can remember that very clearly.
Yes.
In fact, I remember the time that we did it, because we were in New York, and we were standing. I mean, it was very odd, really. We were standing on the top of one of the towers of the World Trade Center, weren't we?
That's right.
And it was in September 2000, so almost exactly a year to the day before 9/11, and we'd struggled for so long and come so far, and we'd had to get to a point where we were okay with not having children. We were okay with this being our lot in life, and what God might want for us, and we had to give that to Him and be okay with that, and that was quite a it was a big thing for us.
Yes, very much so.
The huge irony of that was that an abiding memory that I have is of sitting at our kitchen table in Shropshire, where we were living at the time, watching on the television as the events of that awful afternoon of 9/11 unfolded, and it was just 6 days before Stephanie was born. So that was there was a very personal sort of connection in there for us. But that pain of losing those children is something that you know we've lived with, we will always live with. And I think one of the things that I would say to other people maybe going through that is that it's okay that it's not okay. It's okay that it's a big deal, because it is, actually. It's a big deal for dads as well as it is for mums.
It is, and you know, if I was going to go through it all again, I think we would do things a little bit differently, but I would encourage couples to talk to each other about it, you know, be open about it. I would also encourage you to talk to God about it, pray to God, you know, enable Him to help you, and just really bring it to God, and I would also recommend sort of seeking help if needed, you know, from the medical profession or from counsellors. I'd have a lower threshold for that as well.
Thank you so much, Martin, for sharing with us. I hope that maybe what Martin said has had been some help for other fathers who may have had or be having similar experiences, but now he's kind of needed to get back behind the camera again and get on with his other job. So Martin and I, we have had a deep personal experience of losing babies before birth, but we have no experience at all of losing children after that stage. And I wouldn't want to talk much about that because I don't feel myself qualified, other than to acknowledge the pain that comes with it. We are going to have another break now, another opportunity. I'm not going to leave you with questions, but just the opportunity to think about this or to discuss this, talk it through yourselves, maybe your own personal experiences, either of yourself dealing with this or of people that you've known and loved, or maybe you know people that are going through these things now, and maybe some of what we've said has helped you to think about how you'll deal with them. But what I do want to be very clear about is that if this subject brings up issues for you that you would like to discuss further, then there really are, as Martin has said, there are people who can help. And I've just put together on this screen just a few of the places that you can go to. The Child's Bereavement Trust, the one at the top there, that's a great source of support and information, as is the next one on the list, Compassionate Friends. Cedar Oak is a charity that we at Crofton Parish have long had connections with. It supports people who are suffering distress caused by the loss of a baby, either before or after birth. And Winston's Wish, the bottom one there, is a charity that supports children and their families when they have experienced the loss of a child. So it might be a sibling who's experienced the loss of a child, or parents. But you know, if you just want to talk to someone about this, then please do feel free to email me. My email address is at the bottom there, beth@croftonparish.org.uk. I may be able to be of some help. But if I can't help you myself, then I will almost certainly know someone who can help you. So please do feel free to contact me if you would like to. So we're just going to break now for an opportunity to talk about all of this yourselves. For the last section of this Bible study, we're going to have a look at the rest of this encounter. This lady, this widow, who has already lost her husband, now she's lost her son. her only child. This is as bad as it can get for her. And then she meets Jesus. And if you were with us on Sunday morning, or if you've caught up online, then you will know that we focused then on verse 13. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." Jesus, in his utter humanity, is so moved by her grief. We have no reason at all to think that Jesus knew this family, that he'd ever met this lady before this day, and yet he understands her pain, her grief. His heart goes out to her, and he says, "Don't cry." It's just the most human interaction. It's the most beautiful, heartfelt response. Luke goes on to tell us that Jesus raised her son from death, and that is very, very important. We have 3 recorded instances in the Gospels of Jesus raising someone from dead. John tells us the story of Lazarus, and all of the other 3 Gospel writers tell us about Jairus' daughter. And then we have this story, which is only in this Gospel. And it's really important for us to remember that by raising this man from death, Jesus isn't just taking away the widow's pain and grief. He isn't just giving her back the means to be supported or to have an income. He's giving her back her dignity as well. He is lifting her from being a person right at the bottom of her society. He's lifting her up the pile, if you like. And because being fully human, that is about justice as well as about righteousness. And Luke is the only gospel writer to tell us about this encounter, this miracle, putting it here and putting it in chapter 7 immediately after the story about the healing of the centurion's servant. And that is no accident. Luke is telling us that the good news about Jesus isn't just bringing salvation to the realm of disease. It's bringing it to death itself. All of that is a really very big, massively big deal. And it's all very, very important. And what we looked at on Sunday morning, what we focused on then was the fact that although Jesus did fix this lady's problem, that wasn't the first thing that he did. His first reaction towards her was just so human. In his humanity, he understood her pain and her suffering, and his heart went out to her. He said, "Don't cry." That's great. But look, what if he hadn't fixed the problem? The passage that we're looking at today is lovely. It's a lovely story. It has a very happy ending. But what about us? What about those times in all of our lives when the ending isn't happy? When our lives just seem to be so totally overwhelmed with suffering and difficulties? I think that there are more people than ever out there right now living like that in this current ongoing crisis. People are suffering in so many ways. They're frightened. They're frightened of losing their jobs, their livelihoods, their homes. People are frightened of the silent enemy that we are living with, frightened of getting sick themselves or of passing a sickness on to someone else. We're all frightened of losing those we love. Many, many people out there are living in isolation. They're living without human contact. That community, that's one of the marks of humanity, one of the things that we were created for. And the truth is that God doesn't always fix our problems immediately. But the important thing for us to remember today is that he will always comfort us. And that is now, here, immediate, whenever and wherever we need it, if we allow him to. Fixing the problems, that will come. Sometimes it comes now, but not always. Not always now, but one day. Many of you will know that my father died at the beginning of April, not long after we went into this lockdown time. He was a godly man, and he walked every day with Jesus. And then one day he just started forgetting things, becoming confused, and gradually he developed Alzheimer's. It progressed, and we reached a stage where he knew nobody. He was bedbound, he was incontinent, he had no quality of life, no peace, no dignity. And I used to pray so hard that he would either be healed or be taken home to be with Jesus, which is what he used to cry out for when he was still able. And yet, he lived for another 5 years after he got that bad. It is very, very hard to see someone that you love suffer so much. But now, well, he has got what he wanted. He is with the Lord that he spent his whole life here on earth with. And those awful, difficult years, they will seem just a tiny drop in the bigger picture of the eternity that he will now spend with Jesus. And, you know, there were many, many times when I would travel home from the nursing home that he was in down in South Kent, when I would just struggle with the whole situation and cry out to God because it all seemed so terribly unfair. It wasn't easy. It hurt. But I can say honestly from the depths of my heart that God was always, always there with me in the middle of that suffering, comforting me, because he does understand. He suffers too. He is also fully human. And when we hurt, he hurts too. So look, as we come to a finish this evening, what I'd like for us to think about on our own or in our small groups if possible is how can we lean in on that comfort from God when we need it the most? And also, how can we make sure that we reflect that humanity that we see in Jesus when we interact with other people who are suffering? I think that this is an incredibly relevant and important subject for us to think about right now when so many people are isolated and are alone. I've suffered and experienced the profound difficulty of dealing with grief and loss on my own. The widow of Nain wasn't mourning alone. Her community was there with her, and yet we're finding ourselves today unable to have that experience, to share our mourning. So how can we make sure that in the middle of this crisis, in the middle of these difficult circumstances, we can make sure that people don't feel isolated at the most difficult, the most vulnerable times of their lives? Thank you so much for joining me in this Bible study. I do hope that it has given you something to think about, something to talk about together. I'm going to say goodbye now, and I'm going to leave you with these last 2 questions. Thank you for joining me.